October of 1907 began with a coolness in the air over New York City, a familiar harbinger of autumn that carried no particular menace. The leaves in the modest city parks turned their colors on a predictable schedule, and the routines of the metropolis proceeded with the steady, percussive rhythm of commerce and labor. Arthur Vance, a man of 68 years, observed this seasonal shift from the window of his small apartment on a quiet street in Greenwich Village. He had lived in the city his entire life, and he had learned that its true temperament was not revealed in the headlines of the newspapers, but in the subtle accelerations and decelerations of its daily life. He was a man defined by a lifetime of quiet, meticulous work. For 45 years, he had been an archivist, not for a grand library or a government office, but for a small, now-defunct mercantile exchange that had dealt in commodities shipped from distant ports. His domain had been a basement room filled with oak cabinets, and his work had been the preservation of paper. He understood the language of ledgers, the chemistry of ink, the slow decay of pulp, and the stories told by the faint impressions left on a blotter. He had retired 3 years prior, his position rendered obsolete by new methods of record-keeping, but the habits of a lifetime remained. His apartment was a testament to order. Books stacked by size and subject, papers filed in labeled boxes, and a small workspace kept immaculately clean. He was a man of the past, living quietly in the present. On the morning of Tuesday, October 22nd, the rhythm of the city broke. It did not break with a sudden crash, but with a gathering roar that began downtown and radiated outward, a wave of human anxiety that was as palpable as the autumn chill. The newsboys shouted it on the corners, a run on the Knickerbocker Trust Company. Arthur did not need to buy a paper. He could feel it in the hurried footsteps on the pavement below his window, in the strained, high-pitched tenor of conversations that drifted up from the street. The problem, which had been a whisper in the financial pages for a week, had become a physical reality. It was a crisis of faith, and faith was the only thing that held the entire structure of the city's finances together. The Knickerbocker, the third largest trust in New York, was considered a fortress of stability. Its president, Charles T. Barney, was a man of impeccable reputation. Yet, the fortress was besieged not by an army, but by its own depositors, a frantic crowd of men and women demanding their money, all at once. This was not the first financial panic Arthur had witnessed. He remembered the panic of 1873, a brutal affair that had followed the failure of the banking house of J. Cook and Company and had plunged the nation into a long, grinding depression. He remembered the anxiety of his parents, the hushed conversations about lost savings. He had been a young man then. He also remembered the panic of 1893, another sharp, vicious contraction that had shuttered banks and factories across the country. The community, the collective wisdom of the city, had come to accept these events as a kind of natural disaster, like a hurricane or a blizzard. They were cyclical, inevitable, and ultimately unsolvable. They were the price of a dynamic economy. Men who tried to find a single cause were dismissed as cranks or conspiracy theorists. The failures were always attributed to the overreach of a few speculators, the reckless gambling of men like F. Augustus Hines and Charles W. Morse, whose recent failed attempt to corner the market on United Copper stock was being blamed as the trigger for the current crisis. The narrative was simple. A few bad apples had soured the entire barrel. The solution, if there was one, was to wait for the storm to pass and for a strong man to restore order. At the center of this storm, in his library at the corner of Madison Avenue and 36th Street, sat that strong man. John Pierpont Morgan was 70 years old, a figure of such immense wealth and power that he functioned as a parallel institution to the United States Treasury. His word could move markets, stabilize currencies, and create or destroy industries. As the chaos mounted at the Knickerbocker Trust, it was to this library, a marble palazzo of art and commerce, that the city's financial leaders turned. They came in a procession of carriages and motor cars, their faces grim, their top hats held tightly in their hands. They were presidents of banks, heads of trusts, brokers from the stock exchange, all seeking guidance, reassurance, and, most importantly, capital from the one man who seemed to possess an infinite supply of all three. Morgan's assessment of the situation was swift, decisive, and public. He operated from a position of unassailable authority. He gathered the facts from his network of partners and allies, his mind a formidable ledger of assets and liabilities. The problem, as he and his circle defined it, was a contagion of fear sparked by the incompetence of men like Barney, Hines, and Morse. The Knickerbocker had been mismanaged, its reserves tied up in speculative ventures. The public's panic was understandable but irrational. The solution was not to investigate a deeper cause, but to build a firewall of cash. He dismissed any notion of a coordinated, deliberate effort to destabilize the market. To him, such ideas were the fanciful paranoia of the ignorant. The system was not being attacked. It was merely cleansing itself of its weakest members. His proposed solution was a massive, expensive infusion of liquidity, a pool of money contributed by the strong banks, under his direction, to prop up the solvent but threatened institutions. It was a general solution, overwhelming force applied to the point of crisis. The chorus of skeptics, in this case, was a chorus of affirmation. The men at the Union League Club, the brokers on the floor of the exchange, the editors of the major newspapers, they all echoed Morgan's assessment. He was the savior, the embodiment of financial stability. Editorials were written praising his decisive action, his selfless commitment to the public good. The narrative solidified with each passing hour. The panic was a wildfire, and J.P. Morgan was the fire chief, organizing the bucket brigade. The community of Wall Street, a small and insular world, closed ranks around its leader. This consensus had the effect of rendering any other viewpoint invisible. It isolated anyone who saw not a natural disaster, but a controlled demolition. It created an atmosphere where questioning the official story was not just contrarian, but foolish. The men in the top hats, rushing in and out of Morgan's library, had no time for alternative theories. They were facing financial ruin, and they clung to the one man who offered a plausible path to survival. The prevailing opinion was not just an opinion. It was a shield against the terrifying complexity of the truth. Arthur Vance read the accounts in the evening paper, the laudatory columns praising Morgan's intervention. He saw the photographs of the worried men of finance huddled on the steps of the Morgan Library. He felt the city's collective sigh of relief, the desperate hope that this one man could hold back the tide. But Arthur did not feel relief. He felt a cold, familiar certainty. He folded the newspaper, placed it neatly on the corner of his desk, and walked to the small, iron safe that sat in his closet. He worked the combination lock, the tumblers falling into place with a series of quiet clicks that only he could hear. Inside, behind a stack of property deeds and his parents' marriage certificate, was a small, lacquered wooden box. He lifted it out. It was cool to the touch. He did not open it. He did not need to. He knew what was inside. The chaos on Wall Street was not just a crisis. It was a confirmation of a story he had been told 30 years earlier, a story that had begun with his father and a single, discarded piece of paper. The narrative shifted in his mind, the present receding to make way for the deep past. He was no longer in his apartment in 1907, but in a small, gaslit office in the 1870s. His father, Elias Vance, was not a powerful man. He was a head clerk for a brokerage house, a man whose primary assets were his discretion, his flawless memory for numbers, and his beautiful, precise penmanship. He was a man who saw the machinery of finance from the inside, not from the heights of command, but from the engine room where the gears actually turned. He saw the telegrams before they were officially logged. He saw the private ledgers. He overheard the whispered conversations between partners after the market had closed. He was a ghost in the machine, a man whose presence was so constant and quiet that he was often forgotten. Elias Vance had taught his son, Arthur, to see the world in the same way he did. He taught him to look for the story beneath the story. He had a core principle, a simple truth he had gleaned from his years of observing the flow of capital. One evening, after the great crash of 1873 had wiped out the savings of many of their neighbors, he had sat with a young Arthur and explained it. "A panic is not a storm, Arthur," he had said, his voice calm and even. "A storm has no reason. It is a force of nature. A panic is a building collapsing. It looks like a storm of dust and noise, but it happens because someone, somewhere, knocked out a keystone first. The trick is not to watch the building fall. The trick is to find the man with the hammer." This principle was the foundation of a lifetime of observation. and it had been proven to Elias in the most direct way possible. One winter evening, years later, he had been working late, balancing the year-end books. The senior partners were meeting in the main office, their voices low but tense. A fire was roaring in the hearth. As Elias passed the doorway, he saw one of the partners, a man with close ties to the burgeoning Morgan empire, toss a sheaf of papers into the flames. It was a common enough practice, a way of destroying sensitive records. But the man's haste, his furtive glance over his shoulder, caught Elias's attention. He watched as the flames consumed the documents. After the partners had left for the night, Elias, driven by a powerful instinct, went to the hearth. Most of the papers were ash. But one piece, a corner of a thicker sheet of stationery, had been protected by a larger log and had only been charred at the edges. It had fallen away from the main fire. He carefully retrieved it with the fireplace tongs. That fragment was the physical manifestation of his father's wisdom. It was what lay inside the lacquered box in Arthur's safe. It was a piece of a letter no bigger than a man's palm. The paper was high-quality linen bond, scorched brown and black, and incredibly brittle. The ink, a dark iron gall, was faded and in many places obscured by the charring. But parts of it were still legible, tantalizingly so. There were fragments of names, columns of numbers that looked like stock prices or account balances, and dates. Elias had understood immediately that he was holding something dangerous. He did not show it to anyone. He took it home, wrapped it in silk, and placed it in the box. He told Arthur about it only once, on his deathbed. "The hammer," he had whispered, his strength failing. "I found a piece of the hammer. Be careful with it." Now, in the autumn of 1907, with the city in the grip of a panic that felt so eerily similar to the patterns his father had described, Arthur Vance knew the time had come. His father had given him the knowledge. The unfolding crisis had given him the context. He was not a man of action in the way J.P. Morgan was. He could not command capital or summon bankers to his library. But he had his own set of skills. He was an archivist. He knew how to make dead paper speak. He placed the lacquered box on his workbench. He took a deep breath. His work was not to stop the panic. It was too late for that. His work was to understand it, to prove the principle, to find the keystone and the man with the hammer. He opened the box. He acted with the quiet deliberation that had defined his entire life. There was no grand announcement, no appeal to authority. He did not write a letter to the newspapers or attempt to gain an audience with some city official. Such an act would have been dismissed as the ravings of an old man. The fragment of paper was meaningless without context, and its provenance was impossible to prove. It was the word of a dead clerk against the most powerful men in the country. He knew that the only way to validate his father's discovery was to reconstruct the truth it contained, piece by painstaking piece. His action was internal, a commitment to a process that would take all of his skill, patience, and knowledge. His tools were not the tools of finance. They were the tools of restoration. On his workbench, he laid out a piece of clean, white blotting paper. He placed the charred fragment in the center, handling it with a pair of delicate bamboo tongs. He examined it under a large magnifying glass, the kind used by watchmakers and engravers. The gas lamp on his desk hissed softly, casting a steady, yellow light. His unconventional equipment was a collection of items acquired over a lifetime. He had a set of fine camel hair brushes for dusting away loose particles of char. He had a small, custom-made humidity chamber, nothing more than a glass baking dish with a tight-fitting lid and a damp sponge inside, to slowly reintroduce moisture into the brittle paper fibers, making them less prone to fracture. The most critical tools were his chemical reagents, stored in brown glass bottles with handwritten labels. He had potassium ferrocyanide in a dilute solution of hydrochloric acid. He knew that the iron gall ink used in the 1870s, though faded, left behind trace amounts of iron salts in the paper. The proper chemical treatment could, in theory, react with these iron traces and restore a faint blue or black color to the writing, making it visible once more. This was a dangerous process. Too much acid would dissolve the fragile paper entirely. The process began not with the letter itself, but with preparation. For 2 days, Arthur did not touch the fragment. He spent his time preparing his workspace and his materials. He mixed his chemical solutions with distilled water, using a precise glass pipette to measure the drops. He tested the solution on old, unimportant documents from the same era, documents he had saved from his time at the exchange. He would write on them with his own formulation of iron gall ink, bake the paper in his oven to age and fade it, and then practice the chemical restoration. He observed the results under his magnifying glass, noting how long it took for the color to reappear, how much the paper fibers swelled, how quickly the solution needed to be blotted away to prevent damage. He filled a notebook with his observations, creating a precise methodology. This was not the bold, decisive action of a man like Morgan, who moved millions of dollars with a single command. This was the slow, methodical work of a craftsman, a process that honored the delicacy of the material and the weight of the information it contained. While Arthur worked in the quiet of his apartment, the city outside was in turmoil. The run on the Knickerbocker had been successful. The trust had been forced to suspend payments, its doors closing on a scene of public despair. The panic, however, was not contained. It spread to other trusts, the Trust Company of America, the Lincoln Trust. The newspapers reported on the emergency meetings in Morgan's library, which continued late into the night. They reported on Morgan's efforts to audit the books of the threatened companies, to separate the sound from the unsound. They reported on the millions he and his allies were pledging to keep the stock exchange from collapsing. To the public, this was a heroic, desperate struggle to save the financial system. The skeptics who had initially doubted Morgan were now silent, their fears overshadowed by the magnitude of the crisis. They saw his strange methods, locking the city's bankers in his library until they agreed to pledge funds, as the necessary actions of a wartime general. They did not see a plan, they saw a reaction. On the third day, Arthur decided he was ready. He placed the charred fragment into the humidity chamber and sealed the lid. For 24 hours, he let it sit, allowing the dry, brittle paper to slowly absorb a minute amount of moisture. This was the most delicate phase. If the process was rushed, the paper could turn to pulp. He checked it every few hours, his face close to the glass, watching for any sign of deterioration. The following morning, he judged it ready. The paper had lost its knife-edge brittleness and had become slightly more pliable. He removed it with the tongs and placed it on the blotting paper. His hands were perfectly steady. He took the finest of his camel hair brushes, dipped it into the dilute chemical solution, and blotted most of the liquid off onto a clean cloth until the brush was merely damp. Then, with the focus of a surgeon, he touched the tip of the brush to a tiny, seemingly blank area of the fragment. He was not trying to reveal a word, not yet. He was testing the paper's tolerance. He watched through his magnifying glass. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, slowly, a faint bluish tinge appeared and disappeared as the reagent dried. The paper held. It had not dissolved. He allowed himself a small, controlled exhale. The first step was a success. He began the real work. He chose a spot where the original ink seemed darkest, a place where a word might be hiding. He applied the reagent with a single, light stroke. He waited. Under the focused light of the lamp and the curve of the magnifying glass, the fibers of the paper seemed like a vast, alien landscape. And on that landscape, a ghost was appearing. The faint, ghostly lines of a letter, then another, resolved into a pale blue. The letters formed a word. Terminal. He felt a tremor of excitement, the first crack in his professional composure. He did not allow it to distract him. He took a fine-nibbed pen and a fresh sheet of paper and wrote down the word, noting its exact position on the fragment. He then blotted the restored area with a distilled water solution to neutralize the acid and stop the chemical reaction. The process was incredibly slow. Each application revealed only a few letters. Each application required a subsequent neutralization and a period of drying. It took him 3 hours to reveal a single line of text. The first signs of success were small but profound. By the end of the first week, he had a list of disconnected words and numbers. Terminal, United, Amalgamated, Knickerbocker. The appearance of that last word sent a chill through him. It was no longer a theoretical exercise. The document in his possession, written decades ago, contained the name of the very institution whose collapse had begun the current panic. He worked with renewed urgency, his days and nights blending into a single, focused effort. He slept in his chair for a few hours at a time, waking to check on the drying fragment or to mix a fresh batch of chemicals. He ate sparingly, crackers and tea, his mind entirely consumed by the task. He began to piece together the fragments of information. Next to the word Knickerbocker, he restored a number. 18. He did not know what it meant. Next to United, a reference he assumed was to the United Copper Company. He revealed a date. October 14th, this was the date. He recalled from the newspapers that the corner on United Copper had failed, the event that had publicly triggered the crisis. The letter, it seemed, was not just a list of companies. It was a schedule. His father had not found a piece of the hammer. He had found a piece of the blueprint. This realization did not bring him joy. It brought a heavy, somber sense of validation. The world was not as chaotic as it seemed. The collapse of the building was not an accident. The keystone had been removed with precision. While Arthur toiled in his quiet room, Morgan's battle for the city reached its climax. The foil to Arthur's quiet patience was Morgan's public, brute force intervention. He had saved the Trust Company of America by pledging his own fortune and forcing others to do the same. He had organized a pool of money to keep the stock market from closing. He had arranged for a massive shipment of gold from Europe to replenish the city's depleted reserves. In the eyes of the world, he was single-handedly holding the financial system together. His reevaluation of the crisis was not a reevaluation of its cause, but of its severity. He had, perhaps, underestimated the depth of the public's fear. His solution remained the same, just applied on a larger and larger scale. He was a man who believed that any problem could be solved with a sufficient application of capital and will. Back in the apartment, Arthur made another breakthrough. He had been working on a particularly scorched section of the fragment. The paper was nearly black, and he had little hope of recovering anything. But by using a slightly different chemical formulation, one with a higher concentration of potassium ferrocyanide, he managed to reveal a series of faint markings. They were not words, but names. Stillman, Baker. These were not the names of the speculators being blamed for the crisis. These were the names of the giants of banking, James Stillman of National City Bank and George F. Baker of the First National Bank. They were Morgan's closest and most powerful allies. They were the men who stood beside him in the library, the men contributing to the rescue funds. And their names were on a document that seemed to be predicting or planning the panic they were now fighting to contain. The work was completed on a cold morning in early November. The panic had largely subsided. Morgan had been successful. The runs on the banks had stopped. A semblance of order had been restored. The newspapers were already calling him the savior of Wall Street. Arthur sat at his workbench and looked at his 2 sheets of paper. On one was the restored fragment, now stabilized and resting in a bed of cotton. On the other was his transcription, a neat, alphabetized list of the words, names, and numbers he had managed to recover. It was a skeleton of a document, but the bones told a clear story. It was a list of key companies, including several trusts. It contained a schedule of dates in mid-October. It listed a series of target prices for stocks, prices they had all reached during the lowest point of the panic. And it contained the names of the very men who were organizing the rescue. The success of his work was absolute and undeniable, but it was a success known only to him. He had quantified the blueprint. He took out his own ledgers, volumes of old financial reports he had collected over the years. He began to cross-reference. He traced the ownership of the trusts that had been hit the hardest. He looked at who had purchased their assets when they were forced to liquidate. The buyers, in nearly every case, were entities controlled by or allied with the Morgan Syndicate. The panic had been a massively effective, brutally efficient transfer of wealth. Weaker competitors had been eliminated. Key industrial and financial assets had been acquired for a fraction of their worth. The fire chief had not only put out the fire, he had bought the fire-damaged properties for pennies on the dollar. The math did not require a pencil. It was stark and brutal. The question now was what to do. The knowledge was a burden. He could destroy the fragment and his notes, and the secret would die with him. Or he could try to bring it to light. He thought of his father's warning. Be careful with it. This was not knowledge to be shouted from the rooftops. It was too powerful, too dangerous. The men involved were not just wealthy. They controlled the levers of the entire economy. A direct accusation would be crushed, and he would be ruined, dismissed as a madman. He needed a different approach. He needed a successor, not for his archival skills, but for the knowledge itself. He needed someone young, with the energy and the platform to carry the story forward, but someone with the wisdom to do it carefully. He found him in the pages of a small, independent newspaper called the New York Inquiry. The paper was known for its detailed, investigative articles, often taking a critical stance against the city's powerful monopolies. He had been reading the work of a young reporter named Thomas Riley. Riley's prose was unadorned, factual, and backed by meticulous research. He wrote not with outrage, but with a kind of determined curiosity. He seemed to be a man who, like Arthur's father, was interested in how the building truly worked. Arthur followed his byline for several weeks, reading everything he wrote. He decided that Riley was the one. Arthur did not write a letter or request a formal meeting. He went to the small building that housed the newspaper's offices. He waited outside in the late afternoon, a stooped, anonymous old man in a worn but clean overcoat. When Thomas Riley emerged, a young man of about 30 with an intense, focused expression, Arthur approached him. He did not introduce himself with the full story. He knew that would be met with disbelief. Instead, he used a single, verifiable fact from his research as a key. "Mr. Riley," he said, his voice quiet but clear. "My name is Arthur Vance. I read your work. I have a question for you. Why did the president of the Mercantile National Bank withdraw $2 million in gold from his own reserves on October 15th, one full week before the run on the Knickerbocker?" Riley stopped. He looked at the old man, his expression a mixture of surprise and skepticism. This was not a piece of public information. "Who told you that?" he asked. Arthur simply replied, "I believe the records of the transaction can be found if one knows where to look. I believe you are the kind of man who knows where to look." He then tipped his hat and walked away, leaving the young reporter standing on the pavement, a seed of doubt planted in the fertile ground of his professional curiosity. That single, verifiable fact was the beginning of the foil's return. It was not Morgan himself, but the narrative he had so carefully constructed that was now being approached by a new and unexpected force. Thomas Riley, driven by the old man's strange and specific question, began to dig. He had sources in the Treasury, clerks in the banks who were disillusioned with their leadership. It took him 2 weeks of quiet, patient work, but he confirmed it. The withdrawal had happened, exactly as the old man had said. It was an act that made no sense if the panic was a surprise, but it made perfect sense if it was anticipated. Riley wrote an article. It was carefully worded, framed as a series of questions about the unusual financial movements that had preceded the panic. He did not mention Morgan. He did not make any direct accusations. He simply laid out a series of documented facts that contradicted the official story of an unexpected crisis. The article, published in a small circulation paper, did not cause a firestorm, but it did cause a tremor. It was read by the right people, by bank clerks, by junior partners, by other journalists. It was a crack in the monolithic narrative. The reaction from Morgan's circle was swift and subtle. A rival newspaper published a scathing editorial dismissing the Inquiry's article as amateurish speculation. Thomas Riley's editor received a visit from a lawyer representing a powerful bank, suggesting that their reporting was bordering on libel. The pressure was a form of acknowledgement. They were not ignoring the story, they were trying to smother it. This reaction only confirmed to Riley that he was onto something much bigger. He sought out Arthur Vance again, this time coming to his apartment. He found Arthur at his workbench, surrounded by the quiet order of his life's work. Riley was humbled. He had come expecting a crank, a man with a theory. He found a scholar, a man of facts. "You were right," Riley said, foregoing any preamble. "The withdrawal happened. There were others. How did you know?" This was the moment of acknowledgement, the admission from the world of journalism that the old man's quiet knowledge was superior to their own reporting. Arthur did not gloat. He simply nodded. "I was a keeper of records for many years," he said. "One learns to read the patterns." He decided that Riley had earned the right to see the proof. He laid out the restored letter and his transcription. He explained its origin, the story of his father, the long years of waiting, and the methodical process of its restoration. He walked the young reporter through the connections he had made, the lines he had drawn between the names on the list and the events of the panic. He explained the core principle his father had taught him, to look for the man with the hammer. He spoke for nearly 2 hours, his voice never rising, his presentation as factual and unadorned as a financial statement. He was not telling a story of villainy. He was delivering a report on a mechanism. Riley listened, his initial excitement giving way to a profound, sobering understanding of the scale of what Arthur had uncovered. He knew, as a journalist, that the letter itself was not enough. It was still, in a court of law or public opinion, just a piece of scorched paper. But as the basis for a deeper investigation, it was everything. He now had the blueprint Arthur had spoken of. "What do you want me to do?" Riley asked. Arthur's answer was simple. "The truth should be recorded," he said. "It does not need to be shouted. It needs to be written down, carefully, and preserved." He then made a proposal, a bold and almost unthinkable one. He wanted Riley to arrange a meeting with J.P. Morgan. He did not want to expose him publicly. He wanted to face him, to show him the letter. He wanted the man who had knocked out the Keystone to know that someone had seen him do it. Arranging such a meeting was nearly impossible, but Riley was resourceful. He used the leverage he had. He contacted Morgan's chief of staff, a man named George Perkins. He did not threaten to publish the story of the letter. Instead, he presented a list of 5 more specific, verifiable, and deeply uncomfortable financial transactions he was preparing to report on, all of which pointed to foreknowledge of the panic. He suggested that before he published his next article, Mr. Morgan might be interested in the source of his information, as it related to a matter of historical record from the 1870s. The implication was clear. There was a paper trail, and it was leading directly to Morgan's inner circle. After a week of tense silence, a message was returned. Mr. Morgan would grant them 15 minutes of his time. The meeting took place in the West Room of the Morgan Library. The room was a fortress of culture and power, its walls lined with illuminated manuscripts and Renaissance paintings, its air thick with the smell of old leather and cigar smoke. J.P. Morgan sat behind a massive mahogany desk, his presence filling the room. His eyes, famously piercing and intense, were fixed on the 2 men who stood before him. Perkins stood discreetly by the fireplace. Morgan did not rise. "You have 15 minutes, he said, his voice a low rumble. Arthur Vance was not intimidated. He had spent his life in the presence of paper, and this man, for all his power, was just a man. Arthur walked forward and placed 2 items on the polished surface of the desk, the stabilized letter fragment in its cotton-lined box, and his single sheet of transcribed text. He did not speak. Morgan looked down at the items, his expression unreadable. He picked up the transcription, his large hands surprisingly delicate. He read the list of names, dates, and companies. He looked at the scorched fragment. There was no flicker of surprise in his eyes, but a deep, focused stillness. "My father was a clerk at the house of Drexel, Morgan and Company in the 70s, Arthur said, his voice calm and steady. He saved this from a fire. He believed that financial panics were not acts of God. He believed they were engineered. He taught me to look for the design. He did not accuse. He did not raise his voice. He simply stated the facts as he knew them. He explained the core principle, the idea of the Keystone. He was not a prosecutor delivering an indictment. He was an archivist presenting a document and its context." Morgan listened, his gaze never leaving Arthur's face. The silence in the room was absolute. When Arthur finished, Morgan placed the transcription back on the desk. He looked at the charred fragment for a long time. The admission of error, when it came, was not an apology. It was a quiet, profound acknowledgement of a shared, hidden reality. "Your father," Morgan said, his voice losing some of its harshness, "was a very observant man." He then did something that shocked both Arthur and Riley. He reached for a box of matches on his desk, struck one, and held the flame to the corner of the original letter fragment. He held it until it was fully consumed, dropping the last black flake into a heavy crystal ashtray. He had not destroyed the evidence to hide his guilt. He had destroyed it as a gesture of finality, a private acknowledgement that Arthur's quest was complete. The secret was now shared between them, and it would go no further. The systemic change that followed was not a public reckoning. Morgan would never be charged. His reputation as the savior of the panic would remain intact for the history books. But the knowledge was now adopted by a new carrier. Thomas Riley had seen the truth. He understood that he could not publish the full story of the letter. It was now unprovable, and Morgan was too powerful. But the meeting had changed him. He now had a framework for understanding how power truly operated, not in the headlines, but in the quiet, undocumented meetings, in the letters burned in fireplaces. This knowledge would inform every article he wrote for the rest of his career. He would go on to be one of the lead journalists covering the Pujo Committee hearings years later, the congressional investigation into the money trust that Morgan's actions had helped create. He would not have the letter, but he had the lesson. The enduring symbol of Arthur's work was not the letter that Morgan had burned, but the perfect, handwritten ledger he had created. It was a copy of his transcription and a detailed account of his research, tracing the flow of money during the panic. Before he left the library that day, he had left a second, identical copy of the transcription on Morgan's desk. The copy he kept, he gave to Thomas Riley. "This is for your records," he said. "A story is not true because people believe it. It is true because the facts support it." The ledger was the new record, a testament to the quiet, methodical reconstruction of a hidden truth. The knowledge had been passed on. In the years that followed, the Panic of 1907 became a settled part of history, an event with a simple, accepted narrative. Morgan was the hero. Hines and Morse were the villains. The creation of the Federal Reserve System a few years later was seen as the ultimate solution to prevent such crises from ever happening again. The new stasis was a world with more rules, more oversight, but the underlying principles of power remained. Arthur Vance's success was not a public victory. It was a quiet, personal vindication that became an accepted, respected part of his own life and that of his successor. It was no longer a remarkable secret, but simply a truth they both knew. Arthur saw Thomas Riley one last time, many years later. The journalist was now a respected editor, a man of influence. He visited Arthur, who was now very old, in his same small apartment. They spoke of the changes in the city, the new technologies, the new political battles. Finally, Riley looked at the old man and said, "I've spent my whole career chasing the story you gave me that day. I've never been able to tell all of it, but I've tried to honor it. Did we do the right thing?" Arthur looked out the window at the city below, a city that had forgotten the truth of its own history. "The truth does not need us to defend it," Arthur said. "It only needs us to write it down." You wrote it down. That is enough. He had passed the torch, and the successor had proven he understood the nature of the flame. He was not a firebrand. He was a keeper of the light. History is often written by the victors, its narrative shaped by the men with the most power and the loudest voices. It is a story of grand events, of decisive actions, of heroes and villains. But the deeper truths often reside in quieter places, in the margins of ledgers, in the memories of clerks, in the chemical traces of faded ink on a scorched piece of paper. Some things do not become obsolete. They just wait. They wait for a patient mind and a steady hand to reveal what was there all along, a quiet testament to the fact that the most important events are not always the ones that make the most noise. They are the ones that are planned in silence.